following is an AZPM original production.
Hello and welcome to this latest edition of the Press Room from the radio studios of AZPM. I'm your host, Steve Goldstein. A lot of topics on the table today, many of them revolving around Trump administration immigration policies. And the panelists here to discuss those topics with me are Yana Kunichoff of AZ Luminaria, Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel, Tony Perkins of AZPM, and Tim Steller of the Arizona Daily Star. Thank you all for being here today. I want to start off with Donald Trump sending 1,500 troops to the U.S.-Mexico border. Tim, first of all, do you recall, did he try to do something similar in 2017?
Oh, he's not the only one. A lot of governors, a lot of presidents have sent troops to the border over the years. Usually in recent years, it's been in support roles. So maybe they're back at headquarters with Border Patrol at the station, helping them out maybe with intelligence or that kind of thing, or maybe in the detention center.
Yana, it seemed, though, and we know that, and as what Tim said is correct, that we've seen governors, even governors from somewhat blue states, or at least those from the Democratic Party. But why are we giving this so many headlines? Obviously, it's such an important topic. Is it because it rests in with some of the worries and concerns that a lot of people have about the administration?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what the Trump administration put forward was promised action on the border. So even though I believe it was in December 2023 that Katie Hobbs sent Arizona National Guard to the border, also again in like a support role to work on fentanyl or kind of other drug enforcement issues, I think that this is getting a lot of attention because it's seen as fulfilling a promise, even though I think it's like really unclear what the reality of that will look like here.
Yeah. Tony, how significant do you think this particular number is at this particular time? Again, just a couple of days after the inauguration.
All right. It's not so much about, sending troops to the border, but what are they going to do when they get there? Are they just going to sit around in trucks and that kind of thing? Or are they going to take a more active role? Are they just going to be flying helicopters around? And what are they going to do when they do that? That's the big question. And once we find out what their activities are going to be, that's going to be the real story.
Well, that's interesting, too, because the idea of potentially having planes used to deport folks who are in the custody of CBP in the San Diego, El Paso sectors, that's all tied together, too.
I think that's probably the most interesting thing and the biggest change from the Trump administration. I mean, for the last 20 years or so, we've seen Border Patrol being backed by some element of the Department of Defense, usually National Guard troops. And a lot of states have sent like small helicopter crews to fly patrols. It's a good way for them to train. They can fly at night. They can fly in remote areas. But it's also, of course, this cross-border thing. That, though, the change is using actually military air command to actually fly people in C-17s or whatever to other countries with some, part of a relationship with State Department. That's new. Now, we've long flown people back to their home countries, but we've relied on ICE Air, Immigration Customs Enforcement, flying their own planes. So that really radically expands it. The biggest holdup for those things has always been whether or not those countries agree to take people back. So how are they going to make that work? You'll probably see the Trump administration trying to use economics, other kinds of security agreements, other kinds of things to kind of bully people into taking people back.
Yeah, no, I think the Department of Defense point is an interesting one. What do you guys think of that?
Well, yeah, for sure. He's going to try to use, or he is already using, as whatever's at his hands, and the Department of Defense, of course, he's commander-in-chief, so there's a lot he can do. There are some limits, and there are some precedents that have held presidents back in the past. In 1997, there was a case where Marines shot an 18-year-old boy in Texas who was a shepherd. He had a gun, and he fired his gun, didn't know the Marines were there. They were doing a drug patrol, and they thought he was shooting at them. So it's that sort of thing that is soldiers on the border who are actually trying to interdict people that gets a little more dicey, and I wouldn't be surprised to see it, though.
Well, and I'm cynical, Yana, that, this is broadcast on a PBS and NPR station, but is this partly, though, to the folks who watch Fox News or Newsmax to see the images of, okay, President Trump is backing this up because we're seeing troops, even if there were troops there before that the Biden administration or Katie Hobbs sent down there?
Yeah, I mean,
the visuals,
Yeah, I think that there's like two things happening to me. There's two things happening in the U.S. right now, and one is this like high level, like kind of rhetorical battle of like what this country looks like, what kind of genders people can use, like this idea of like what we can talk about and how people see and understand the country. And then I think there's often a different story of what is happening on the ground and how people at the border, border communities, we live in like a really binational city, are actually experiencing their life there. And I don't think those are necessarily related always to me.
Yeah, Tony, optics, but more than that?
Yeah, the optics are also going to depend a lot on how much time are the troops going to be spending down there. What's it going to look like 6 months from now, 8 months from now, 10 months from now? And we look at that and what good did they do? Has there been a lot of improvements? Has there been any change at all? And that's where some of the political fallout might happen.
One interesting thing that just came back to me is that when Trump was last in office, there was a year, I don't know if it was 2018 or so, when there were 2 deaths, both suicides, I believe, of soldiers. I believe they were soldiers. They were military service members who were deployed here in southern Arizona. I don't know. You sometimes lose track of the fact that these are people, these soldiers or service members who are out there being told to do a job. And sometimes it can be pretty unclear or pretty boring or pretty depressing, depending on their condition.
Well, it's important to note, a lot of times those are National Guard troops. Those are people who have regular jobs, 9-to-5 jobs that they've left. Sure. They have mortgage to pay, and all of a sudden they're sort of stuck out here in the desert waiting around for something. They're on surveillance or, I remember when they were in Nogales, there were guys taking care of horses, and there were also guys in the motor pool. They were, pulling tires off of Border Patrol trucks. So if you're somebody who's been doing that for 6 months and living in a hotel room, getting a per diem, yeah, you can see how that stresses people out. National Guard is supposed to be mostly temporary. So the idea of it extending for long deployments, and we saw this with like them, for Iraq and Afghanistan wars too. We use National Guard really to fulfill roles they're not necessarily built for.
That's right. The politicians make the decisions, but the people on the ground, whether civilians or otherwise, are really put in the crosshairs there.
Yeah, and I think that that's like a really good point about the actual experience of people who are in these institutions and how much oversight there is of them. And also I think when there's a big hiring push, like what that means about who's brought on. And I think also just like from talking to aid organizations, I think this is something we won't see, but it has been something that has happened now for decades. But I think people will probably still try to migrate to the U.S. and those people will be pushed further into the desert the more enforcement there is on the border. And that often means that people die or are more likely to die. And so I just think that there's these dynamics that are happening that are separate from the headlines.
Yeah. And Tim, one thing that could cause Tucson some heartburn to some extent is the DOJ's going to investigate officials who won't enforce immigration policies. And we don't necessarily know what that looks like, but this memo called on U.S. attorneys to investigate and possibly prosecute local officials who stand in the way of immigration authorities. And we already heard from Sheriff Nanos, who he has talked about immigration policies generally, and even on this one, it's very much like, well, wait a second, my folks don't want to be CPP agents, and I could run for Congress, and am I going to? That sort of thing.
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways to slice it, and both sides could get what they want here. There's kind of active resistance, which is, I think, what the Justice Department is most focused on, that is trying to stand in the way somehow, physically or otherwise, of immigration enforcement. And then there's more passive resistance, which is like what you're describing, Sheriff Nanos saying, no, I don't want my deputies used in immigration enforcement. In addition, one of the keys with the Sheriff's Department is the jail and the extent to which they hold people for ICE or other entities to come pick them up. That's maybe the area where I foresee the most, the rubber meeting the road on this conflict.
Yeah, and Tony, the term sanctuary cities, of course, has to come up in this all the time. How do you think this could affect Tucson or Pima County going forward?
Well, there's going to be a lot of discussion about in Tucson and other cities too, about weaponizing the Department of Justice. We've heard about that a lot during the campaigns and everything, and now all of a sudden we're talking about Sheriff Nanos having a target on him, along with mayors and others in the other sanctuary cities, and you have to step back and say, well, wait just a second, that's something that we're supposed to be getting away from. but it works for one side and not for the other.
Well, Tim mentioned both sides. The idea of that's going to be weaponizing on each side is going to be if the DOJ is going to be going after county attorneys, county sheriffs, et cetera, that doesn't seem like a smooth path to actually having immigration policy that works for anybody.
No, I mean, I think if they really push, I mean, they're going to end up in a legal fight over the 10th Amendment. I mean, there's really big limitations to how much the federal government can coerce somebody to do something, especially state and local officials. And we've had dozens of legal fights about that, and really limited how much the federal government can say you must do this. Especially on federal laws, and immigration being, of course, something that the federal government has long said is their purview. So to suddenly order TPD officers to help them, they can't really do that. But I think Tim's right. What they'll probably really do is go after the idea if a jail has somebody and ICE issues a detainer, they're going to demand that the jail hold somebody, and that puts the jail into a bad spot. I mean, ultimately, if somebody says, "Hey, my due process, I was released, and I'm still here. You're violating my due process," that falls on the county, and the county is going to want to not be in that situation. Lots of other cities and counties have been in that situation, and they've actually lost money. They've been sued successfully because they held people waiting for ICE to show up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that there's just a really interesting, the Trump administration has also pulled back from some of the DOJ's oversight of local police departments at the same time as it is, I think, saying that the DOJ will obviously be looking more closely at police departments that don't follow in line with its policies. And I think the other thing that's interesting to think about, I lived in Chicago for a long time. It is a sanctuary city. That law came to pass from a lot of organizing on the ground. Mm-hmm. So I think absolutely the county jail is going to be where the rubber meets the road. And also I think a city that has those kind of policies has a lot of people who have spent decades organizing in immigrant communities. Mm-hmm. And I think actually what they do now matters as much as whether maybe a local police officer will assist.
Well, what about this concern that undocumented migrants might be in formerly protected areas of either schools or places of worship, and that may be changing as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've already gotten what turned out to be false tips of ICE at schools, and not locally, but in other cities, and because I used to be an education reporter, and I think that those have turned out to be false, but like the fear that they've created is really real. And so I think what I've seen when we see that fear is parents who are more worried about asking for food aid from school, or right, who are less likely to talk to teachers or go to a parent-teacher day. So I think the fabric of some of the communities that are non-citizens in the U.S. kind of depends on engaging with institutions like schools and churches, and I think people are going to be more afraid now.
And I think that's part of, I mean, that's sort of one of the Trump administration's wants. It wants, as they say, shock and awe, mm-hmm, right? To steal a phrase from the Iraq War. The idea is we're just going to hammer people so hard that they stop fighting and that we can do what we want. And that is part of this. And I think they really want to have some fear, and we have to see how organizations are able to kind of make sure people feel okay about the things that are happening. They understand their rights, probably understand their relationships with what the ICE can do, what ICE really can't do, and how that's going to work with local enforcement is going to be really important to make sure people understand exactly how this is going to work through the future.
Tony? And
it's also a matter of spreading this pain around this issue to all sorts of people who are not accustomed to this pressure. School teachers, mm-hmm, county jail operators, people who say, well, this wasn't supposed to affect me directly, but now it's extremely affecting people who probably aren't really used to that.
Tim, I'm really trying to think in perspective again. When Donald Trump's first term happened, a lot of people in the same realm were terrified, no question. But there was also the concept, at least, for those of us who follow the politics of it so closely, that, well, there were some guardrails. Not every Republican in the Senate or the House was necessarily bowing down to him. There were even members of his cabinet who were like, okay, we like some of this, maybe not others. It almost feels like there aren't guardrails right now. Does that make people more worried?
Well, I think, as Paul said, that's an image that they want to project. But I do think that there's a battle. I mean, from what I've read and seen, there is a conflict within the administration between over kind of how to handle the deportation idea. For example, on one side, Tom Homan, I think I can't remember his title, but the czar of this operation, wanted to prioritize people who have committed crimes and have deportation orders, that sort of thing. He seemed to, although he was rhetorically very tough, have a more organized sense of like, this is the priority, which is what other presidents have done. Whereas on the other side, Stephen Miller and people like that want this sense of fear for the purpose that Paul is talking about, and others that, that people will, quote unquote, self-deport or hide or what have you.
Yeah, it makes me think of what you said about the DOJ and the investigation into police departments. I think about Phoenix specifically, which was certainly under the radar when it comes to this. But one of the things that's talked about a lot with community policing is if there's less trust in certain communities, then you won't have people actually coming in and talking to police about serious crimes because they're afraid they might get deported or something. Feels like that's the same sort of thing we're seeing again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is real, that I think for a lot of institutions, and particularly policing, to function, you need to have people have a relationship with it. And I think that these kind of policies change those relationships. And I also think like how we understand, like, for example, I think a lot of crime that happens from people who, especially like gender-based crime against women, happens from intimate partners, but that is not necessarily like what we always read about. So I think our understanding of like what is happening on the ground versus the rhetoric, again, I think there's that gap.
Okay, Tim, another topic related to Trump immigration policies. Attorney General Chris Mays got involved with this one, the push to eliminate birthright citizenship, which has been temporarily blocked by a federal judge. Yes. Attorney General Mays, a number of other states got involved in this. Is this going to be blue versus red as well? Because there's a 14th Amendment concern obviously here too. Right.
Yeah. So they have these consortia of states that band together and sue. So Arizona joined Washington and some other attorneys general from these states and sued in Washington federal court.
Thank you for saying attorneys general, by the way.
Thank you. You got it. They won a early temporary restraining order. The judge said it was blatantly unconstitutional. What I found surprising about the birthright citizenship order is that it says that if neither parent is a citizen or permanent resident, that the child cannot be a citizen. In other words, if you are here legally on work visa for a couple of years, maybe both parents are on work visas, or they're students, grad students at the University of Arizona, that sort of thing. If their child is born here, they are not a citizen under this executive order.
Yeah. Tony, what stands out to you about this effort again and the fight against it?
Well, it appears to be, and we can't say for sure anymore these days that it's a slam dunk because it's an unconstitutional thing. It's actually written in the Constitution. And so the question is going to be, are you going to go have a fight against the Constitution as well as a red versus blue fight, and how's that going to play politically? Lawmakers, people in Congress are going to have to choose sides on this issue, especially more than others, I think.
Well, and Paul, it makes me think of the infamous former state Senate President Russell Pierce, who brought back the term anchor babies as this pejorative, and this almost sounds like a lot of the Trump supporters are kind of into that.
I mean, we've had this argument for more than a century. Yeah. I mean, it's important. Like we had this argument in 1898. There was a case involving a Chinese man whose parents were in the United States. He was born here. He went back to China, and on the way back, the immigration authorities at the time said he wasn't a citizen. They went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that he was a citizen in Guam Khmer. We've had this argument. And we had this argument in 1898, and we keep having this argument again about who's a citizen. The court at the time was really clear. If you're a diplomat and you have a child here, they're not a citizen. And if you're an enemy of the state and you have a child here, you're not a citizen. Otherwise, the kid's a citizen. And the court made it really, really clear. And the idea of the way that people are, of course, anchor babies. I mean, it's sort of remarkable because, I mean, the people who come to the United States to have kids specifically to make them U.S. citizens are Russians. Russians for a while were doing that. And then there were people from China who were doing that. It's not the people who are coming across the border, U.S.-Mexico border. They're not coming because they're hoping to have someone who's a citizen here.
And during the time that I worked in China, I worked on a couple of different stories where Chinese were going to places like Guam or U.S. territories that weren't even close to the border, of course, and to have children and have those children have automatic American citizenship.
Yana, I don't want to put you on the spot, but the last question on this one relates to the Ninth Circuit and then the Supreme Court. we're not going to predict how the Supreme Court might go on this, but I mean, for something, as Paul mentioned, that has been in discussion, 1898, and then we go back to the Civil War, this Supreme Court could totally upend that. That's possible, right?
I think this just tells me that I think the courts are playing a really important role right now. I think in some ways they are in some ways the first and maybe the last line of defense against what happens to some of these policies. And in the Birthright citizenship case, the judge was appointed by Reagan. I think it's just interesting how people came to those positions. But yeah, I mean, I think that's what we have to watch.
Tim, briefly on that?
No.
Okay.
Well, maybe we should talk about the one of the things about cases is how Native Americans are also treated as citizenships. One thing that came out as they were arguing.
Was that 1923, by the way?
Yes, exactly. Very, very good.
Yeah.
Also how their relationship is set, and part of the court was pushing around this idea because, of course, they're part of the tribes, and so are they also U.S. citizens? And previously, the courts have said, of course they are, because they have a relationship with the United States, but if the Fourth Amendment gets sort of thrown out, then there's a whole bunch of people that are also their citizenship becomes up in the air too, about are they citizens? And I don't know if the court wants to open that can of worms.
Is the phrase subject to U.S. authority? In the 14th Amendment, there's a phrase that's something like subject to U.S. authority. That is that you have to be, and so that's the phrase that the proponents of Trump's birthright citizenship order are trying to exploit and say that these people are not subject to U.S. authority.
Yeah. About 5 minutes left, Paul. I want to give you a couple of minutes. Really important reporting you did with asylum seekers waiting outside of Sasabe just a few hours before Donald Trump was going to be inaugurated, and the experience and some of the different nations that people are from. But I wanted to focus more on the volunteers, the support effort that goes into all that, and the attitude of those folks. Were they focused just on supporting these migrants, or were they really concerned about what's to come next? Did you talk more about that or no?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things I think is sort of striking is how every time that when a volunteer would kind of show up, they would say hello and they would say, I'm a friend. That was the first thing that they always kind of how they introduced themselves. And then it was always about kind of taking care of people. It was really ridiculously cold out there. And so most of their effort was keeping the fire going to keep people warm, and then also bringing people soup and hot chocolate. It was really about kind of taking care of people. And that effort has been really going on for a long time, in this particular space for more than a year. And it's really because people are coming across the line and they are really pushed there by smugglers. They don't know where they are. They don't quite know exactly what, but they're supposed to wait for Border Patrol. That's really what they know. And they're sort of just waiting. And, Border Patrol takes time to get out there. I mean, it's really remote. The terrain's really rugged. It's 12 miles, east of Sasabe. And it's a long drive. It takes a long time. And you really need to have four-wheel drive until just recently they kind of finished the road. And so that effort was really about taking care of people. A year ago, I went out there. It had rained. It was cold, and there was this really sense that there were about 80 people. They were all families. A lot of them had kids, and they were trying to keep people from freezing to death. I remember there was this one little boy. He essentially said, "I can't really feel my feet. I'm really, really cold." And this guy said, "I got you." And he pulled off, got some socks, changed the socks, put them on the kid, and you could watch this kid warm up. You could watch him in his face. He was actually more comfortable. And those guys have been doing that for a year. And there's really now a sense. There's two big questions about it: whether or not they're going to be able to keep doing that, because Border Patrol and the Forest Service may close the road. And if they do that, they don't know what they're going to do. And they've been able to really help people, and also kind of people come across the line, and rather than trying to keep going north into the desert, instead kind of keeping them in one place so that they can turn themselves in Border Patrol and ask for asylum.
So one other question on this. It may seem absurd based on the date. It was January 19th. Mm-hmm. Were these migrants aware that how important January 20th was potentially? They
all knew that something was happening, that the new president was coming. They all knew who President Trump was. But in terms of whether or not they understood what the consequences when they're going to be, that's hard. Yeah. It's always hard to understand from migrants' perspective, because they're all really different. They have sort of different messaging. They're coming. They don't know. They don't know the contours of U.S. immigration law, or necessarily the contours of the politics. What they know is that they have someone who's in the United States who's also come, and that this is the pathway they took. And this is the pathway to being safe, or to rejoining with their family, or to maybe some economic benefit. Maybe they get to work, but they're really there because they want to seek asylum.
And if you want to read that terrific story, you can find it online on the Tucson Sentinel. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Tim, let me turn to you on this. You're my political junkie on the panel. I'm going to say Andy Biggs from my neck of the woods, generally, is presumably going to run for governor, even after Donald Trump gave a lot of support to Karen Taylor Robeson, who was the runner-up to Kari Lake before, but she raised a lot of money for his campaign. And yet, a lot of Donald Trump's supporters ideologically aligned more with Andy Biggs. Maybe they were supporters of January 6th. And Andy Biggs, we don't have confirmation, but Andy Biggs clearly was somewhat a supporter of that event, maybe a great supporter of that. How does all this dynamic affect things, you think? Are you surprised that Biggs would leave a safe seat in Congress to do this?
Well, I mean, it sets up a familiar pattern, which is the more MAGA candidate versus the less MAGA candidate. Except in this case, the twist is that Donald Trump has already endorsed what we can perceive in this race as the less MAGA candidate. Of course, he's been known to change his mind. I mean, it's early times, and I would expect that Republican primary voters will have will be very favorable toward Andy Biggs, and they voted against Karen Taylor Robeson before in favor of Kari Lake in the last Republican primary for governor. So I don't see why it wouldn't happen again, except for that Trump factor.
Yeah. Tony, a few seconds on that. Any thoughts come to mind as someone who's just been involved as a journalist for so long? This seems like something that was a slam dunk for Karen Taylor Robeson. Andy Biggs giving up a safe congressional seat. That's what keeps coming back for me.
Right. Again, like Tim was saying, who's more MAGA and who's less MAGA?
Yeah.
Biggs's opinions have been pretty much out there, and it's going to be interesting in the next couple of years to, among the MAGA crowd, you think, well, is that too far to go with Andy Biggs? Or do I want to have a more safe choice, if you want to call it a safe choice?
Mm-hmm. Well, we also know coming up, this will be the first time Arizonans will vote on a running mate as well. It'll be a lieutenant governor. We'll see if Andy Biggs tries to find some moderate Republican, if there is such an animal left. Tony Perkins of AZPM, thank you. Tim Steller, Arizona Daily Star. Yana Kunichoff, AZ Luminaria. Paul Ingram of the Tucson Sentinel. Thank you all for being here. And thank you all for watching and listening to The Press Room. We'll be back next week. I'm Steve Goldstein.